Welcome to the Shootil Podcast, a podcast for any and all camera shooters. My name is Martin Depict. I'm a photographer, videographer, and graphic designer based in Los Angeles. And today, I want to talk to you guys about ISO settings. Now, I know this is sort of like a basic topic, but I'm not going to go through the exposure triangle with you guys. I'm assuming that most of you guys watching this know how to expose for a good photo or how to expose for a good video. What sort of got me thinking about the perfect ISO setting was a conversation that I had with a friend about ISO variants. Let me just read you guys the definition of what an ISO variant camera is. An ISO variant sensor will produce the same result in terms of image quality if you underexpose the photograph and then raise the exposure in post-processing as if you had exposed it correctly in camera in the first place. Meaning that if you took a photo at 100 ISO, but it's 3 stops underexposed, you would then go into whatever program you guys use to color and light correct your images and just raise the exposure 3 stops to what would be ISO 800. And the image in post would look exactly the same as if you would have taken the photo at ISO 800. So by understanding this, I know that we can sort of like push it, but I was wondering if we can pull the ISO down. Now, how I learned about ISO was through film. Now, ISO is basically how sensitive the film is to light. So you would put the film inside your camera, set the camera to that specific ISO or the light meter, whatever you're carrying around to measure your light, and then take photos with that specific ISO in mind. So you would make sure that you're exposing correctly depending on the type of film that you have in your camera. Now, when digital cameras became a thing, ISO became how sensitive the sensor is to light. And then this became something that you can change picture to picture. You were no longer tied to a whole roll of the same ISO setting or the same ISO sensitivity. So that gave everyone who was shooting digital this freedom of being able to change your ISO whenever you wanted. I think the biggest difference between digital and film is that when it comes to film, you're able to retain the highlights easier and you lose the shadows easier. And then when it comes to digital, you lose the highlights in the image easier, but you're able to retain a lot more of the shadows in the photo. So since we knew that, everyone learning digital photography learned how to shoot exposing for the highlights. That's something that we always heard whenever we were shooting, is that expose for the highlights. Make sure that your highlights aren't clipping, because if you clip those highlights, they're gone. As I was looking into this, I was getting a better understanding about how ISO worked in video. I've seen these graphs, that Gerald Undone posts on his YouTube channel or other YouTube channels of how they measure how much dynamic range a camera can have in video during or while you shoot log. And I found it pretty fascinating how if you're at a specific ISO, you get the best dynamic range in both directions. So like a lot of the times there's like a first base ISO, which is usually 800 ISO. And at 800 ISO, you have a pretty even amount of highlights that you can push it to, that it retains in the information. And you also have a good amount of shadow retention in the lower end. So as I was sort of understanding this, obviously learning what was the best case scenarios, how to expose for video, right? Because for me, I always thought that it was probably best to underexpose in photo. But when it comes to video, I think it's probably a little best to overexpose just a tiny bit, especially when you're shooting log, because if you underexpose in video too much, then you get a lot more grain in your footage. And so I'm trying to sort of like teach myself these things and figure out the best way that I can use these tools to create what I want to create. Now, all these are sort of pretty basic things, but the ISO settings is always like a tricky part to me, because there's like view assist in a lot of the cameras that I use, whether it's the Canon R3 or the Canon R5C or the DJI 4D. These are all cameras that have view assist. When it comes to the more cinematic cameras like the C70 or the 4D, those have false color, which is sort of like a setting that lets you know where certain ranges of light are. using a specific color. So I sort of have it set up to where I like to keep my skin tones in this sort of like pink color area or green color area. And that's where I'll sort of expose everything to. So it's very helpful when it comes to that stuff. But on cameras that don't have false color, I always have issues knowing what is the right exposure. So for instance, the R3, if I'm shooting in log with this camera, right now I'm shooting in log with it, and I'm not able to tell if this is a properly exposed photo. It might be too grainy. My face might be too dark. This is actually a sort of new setup that I'm using today, where as of before, I was using a 16 millimeter f2.8 lens with no ND filter, and now I'm using a 24 millimeter f1.8 lens with an ND filter. So with this setup, I had to, boost the light a little bit more. This sort of like hair light behind me is not as bright as in other videos. My shirt's probably a lot darker. So this is a learning process. I'm learning through all this, especially with the different tools that I have. But when it comes to photos, I've been doing photo for a lot longer than I've been doing video. The camera that I said I wasn't going to mention anymore, the Fuji X100VI and the Fuji X100V, they have this setting called DR 100, 200, and 400. So it's basically just a dynamic range setting that when you're shooting in those settings, it's sort of letting the camera know how much information you want to retain in the highlights or in the shadows. And so that information is mainly meant for the JPEG. And so I did a bunch of testing. And by testing, I mean that I went out and I took photos of like high dynamic range situations. And I tried shooting them in different ISO settings between ISO 100 and 800. Because 800 was the ISO that I shoot my video in. It's sort of like the base ISO, meaning that a lot of these sensors have been tested and been shown to retain a lot more of that information. And so I shot with that in mind. And then I tested ISO 800 against lower ISOs, ISO 400, ISO 250, and ISO 100. So these are all a stop apart. So this is 3 stops in between. So I took a bunch of photos, some that were perfectly exposed, some that were underexposed, some that were overexposed, and I wanted to see how the camera retains the highlights. And so let me just show you guys what I got here. All right, so here are the photos that I took of another shooter, Mr. John Wick over here. And so these first couple photos are photos out of my X100VI. And so I have a few open here, and here on the right side, upper right side, is where you can see the settings. So this first one is ISO 125, which is the base ISO for that camera. And then I shot it at f5.6 at 2/50th of a second. And so at ISO 125, the setting DR 100 is available. So this DR 100 setting doesn't allow you to retain much highlight information up here. So this is the HEIF file, which is basically another version of JPEG. Is just a less lossy version, or just a more optimized version of JPEG. And then here is the raw file. So if I lower the exposure, you can see that there wasn't much information saved here in the shadows, or in the highlights, I mean. And you can tell that by the histogram as well, this big spike here at the end. That's the highlights. These are the blown out highlights there at the end. So this next one is at ISO 500. So at ISO 500, you can start using DR 400, which is their highest dynamic range setting that you can use. And here you can tell that a lot more of the highlights were retained here in the highlights. You can see a little bit of the sky and some of the trees back here, as opposed to this one where the sky is completely blown out. You don't see any of that. And so again, this is the HEIF file, and then here is the raw file. So if I turn this down, you can see a lot more information here, and it's still blown out, but that's obviously the sun there. And now we'll sort of check out the middle ground. This is DR 200, which is sort of like obviously the in between 100 and 400. And There was a little bit of retention, but not as much as the DR400. There's still some blowout, and then I can just show you guys the difference between this one and this one. So you can see a lot more information retained here as opposed to this one. That's just, the sun's just completely blown out and it almost looks gray. It's just gray up there. So having tested this out for myself, I wanted to test it with a camera that I use fairly often, my Canon R5C. So I started using my Canon R5C for photos instead of my R5 because the Canon R5C has a dual gain sensor in it, meaning that I felt like, I know for video it's a good thing to use. Like when you're shooting at higher ISOs, ISO 800 is sort of like the base for video, and then ISO 3200 is that sort of second base. So when you hit that second base, that noise level in the video sort of drops again, and so you get a nice clean image again at 3200 ISO. And so because of that, I thought it might be worth it to use it for photos. I know it's more of a hybrid camera, but you know it is a hybrid camera, so I'm using it as intended. So here are the photos that I took with the R5C. Again, here's John Wick. And so this first one was at ISO 800 at f2.8 and 8,000th of a second. So this was sort of fairly well exposed. I used the light meter in the camera. So whenever you're looking through the camera or the screen on the back of your camera, on the bottom of the screen or through that viewfinder, you see like a meter with a positive on the right side and a negative on the left side. And your goal, that's your light meter, and your goal is to basically line up that line right in the middle. So this is what a perfect reading on that light meter was giving me. And it is a pretty good shot. I mean, like if I raise the exposure, there's some information still in the shadows. If I lower the exposure, there's a little bit of information here in the highlights, but it's pretty much blown out. You see that big spike in the histogram here on the right. So I tried other things here. So I tried underexposing the image. So here's the image underexposed. I would say probably it's exposed about 2 stops, maybe 2.5 stops. And so if I lower the highlights, obviously I retain a lot more of the highlights here. This is at ISO 100. So I'm retaining a good amount of the highlights here. And if I push the exposure to 3 stops, I'm getting some noise here in the shadows, but it's not that bad. I don't think it's bad at all. Again, I think this is sort of like the ISO variant sensor doing its thing, is that like I'm pretty sure this is what it would look like if I shot it at ISO 800. The one thing different here is that because I underexposed it, I was able to retain a lot more of the highlights. Now, this is pretty extreme. I don't think anyone should be pushing their photo 3 stops. But in the case of this sort of experiment, I wanted to see what I was going to get when it came to the dynamic range. Now, here is a perfectly exposed image of ISO 400. And again, if I lower the highlights, there's some clipping going on there, but not too bad. Like it's still a decent amount of information that's there. And also if I boost the exposure, there's still a lot of information here in the shadow. The only difference here is that you maybe get a little bit more noise as the ISO did sort of bump up from 100 to 400. This next one is at ISO 800. So this one is at ISO 800, but I underexposed it to retain some of those highlights here on the upper right. So if I lower the highlights here, you can see that the highlights here, because when it's underexposed, matches the ISO 100 when it's underexposed. So it's fairly similar here. 800, 100, and the 800 only looks a little bit sharper here because this one was at f6.3 as opposed to 2.8. So that's the only difference here with the detail in the background. But other than that, it's underexposed again by about 2 or 3 stops. So if I push it, let's go 2.5 here. 2.5. And I lower the highlights. Let's go full 3. So I'm going to full 3 stops, pushing it. Now, this sort of grain structure here, it's kind of a lot. It's a good amount of grain. I wouldn't want to sort of like use images that are this grainy. If you are shooting at this sort of extreme, the good thing is that the denoise tool here in Lightroom works really well. So you come down to denoise, you click denoise, and then I usually just leave it at 50. And here's like the before and after here. So that's before and that's after. And then I just press enhance. And it's going to go ahead and make a copy of this photo. So here's a copy of the image now. And so if I zoom in now, that noise is fairly almost gone compared to this. Here, I'll just zoom into this eye right in the middle, and then I'll do the same thing to this one. So there's the noise pattern for the ISO 800, push 3 stops with the denoise, and then here is ISO 800, push 3 stops without the denoise. So there's a big difference. And to show the ISO variant thing real quickly, so here is ISO 800 perfectly exposed, and here's ISO 100 underexposed by 3 stops. So if I push ISO 100 by 3 stops here, this image and this image should be identical when it comes to grain. So I'm just going to go ahead and zoom into their eye here. So here's ISO 800, and then here is ISO 100 push 3 stops. So again, there's that eye, and here's the other eye. So besides a small difference in light here, meaning that the ISO 800 image was sort of getting a little bit more light, I don't think there's much of a difference here. One is just sort of slightly warmer, and I think that's just sort of the positioning of the sun and behind it. But the ISO grain structure is sort of fairly the same. So shooting at a lower ISO and pushing it is sort of the same thing as if you were sort of raising the ISO in your camera. Now, what I really wanted to find here was sort of like this perfect ISO setting, a setting that will give me like a good amount of balance within the highlights and the shadows. Now, what I did sort of see here when it came to pushing these images, and this is another extreme. So here's the ISO 100 image pushed 5 stops. So this would be the equivalent of you pushing a 100 ISO photo to 3200 ISO. So I'm just making some adjustments here. With the exposure still pushed 5 stops, I went ahead and dropped the shadows by 50. So I'm hoping that some of the shadows here, the grain structure looks maybe a little bit more natural here now. It looks more like ISO 800 now, looking at it. And I dropped the highlights completely to sort of like retain a bunch of the information here. Now, if I did that and pasted these images, pasted that to these images. So this first one is at ISO 100. This one is at ISO 250. This one is at ISO 400. And this one is ISO 800. Again, all the same. So all of them are underexposed by 3 stops. And again, we're pushing them 5 stops. And dropping the shadows by 50 and dropping the highlights by 100%. And so I'm just checking out the grain here. So ISO 800 here is pretty messy. That's pretty unusable. ISO 400 is this image. I'm zooming into the eye. This one is a little bit more usable. Not bad. And then ISO 250, zooming into the eye again. It's hard to tell the difference between 250 and 400, to be honest. So if I were to judge on just grain structure here, so obviously ISO 800, pushing it to that extreme of 5 stops and bringing down the shadows by half of that, and then bringing the highlights all the way down. This sort of like grain structure here is sort of, it's too much. It's not necessarily usable. Using the denoise on it, you could probably get away with it. I mean, that thing does wonders with a bunch of images. And so moving on to the ISO 400, this is more usable. This, if you zoom out, you still get a lot more detail here. There's a lot of information here in the shadows. There's a lot of information here in the highlights. It's a pretty good, clean image. This is a photo that I'm pushing 5 stops, and I think is fairly clean and usable here. Now, the ISO 100 image is even cleaner, but it does still have some noise and grain in it. Now, this sort of kills my theory about whether shooting at a fairly high ISO is worth it. So by doing these tests, if I'm going to be shooting in these sort of high dynamic range scenarios where I'm going to need some of the highlights, where I'm going to need a lot more of the shadows, and I need to sort of find this middle ground, I think the way that I'm going to shoot from now on is I'm going to want to perfectly expose the image on the back of my camera with ISO 400. And then when that image is perfectly exposed on the back of my camera at ISO 400, I'm just going to turn the dial to ISO 250, maybe 100, and sort of retain all that extra information. Because I know that with these ISO variant sensors, I know that I can sort of retain that information in post. I know that I can push it and bring it back. Again, this sort of goes back to basics, and it's the exact same thing as when people say expose for the highlights. Now, if you look at these images, this is sort of what they mean when they say expose for the highlights. It means that you're exposing for that blown out part in the sky, and everything else is going to be dark, and then you're bringing it back in post. And so, as nice as it is, we want to retain the quality of the image and not sort of push it too much. So bringing it down to that ISO 100 gives us so much more latitude, gives us so much more space to play around with it in post. Now moving on to the next thing, if you're shooting in a situation where you're not looking to retain the highlights of anything, you're not in a high dynamic range scenario, then you don't need to expose for the highlights. I think in that case, expose for the subject that you're shooting. So I didn't find the perfect ISO setting. And, obviously I'm a little bummed about that. It would have been nice to think that there's this perfect ISO setting where I was getting the best of both worlds, right? The best capability in low light and the best capability in to be able to handle some of the highlights. And in reality, there isn't. I think that when you're shooting, you just have to make sure that you capture, that you get the shot. And for me, ISO has never been too important. I've always shot, or for the last 8 years now, I've shot with, fairly high-end cameras. And so ISO with these types of cameras have not been an issue. I've shot up to, 10,000 ISO, 12,800 ISO, and I've gone and used those images. I've maybe even done some denoising and still been able to use those images for print or for work, and no one's been able to tell. And what I did here was basically brushed up on exposing for the highlights. So now if I'm ever in these high dynamic range situations, now I know that I can sort of expose my camera at 400 ISO and then underexpose it to 100 ISO, knowing that I'm going to get a really clean image, that I can boost the shadows and still retain some of those highlights. So this taught me a lot about some of the tools that I'm already using. I shot with the X100VI, I shot with the R5C, I shot with the R3. These are all cameras that I'm taking photos with. And so this was definitely worth for me to do. And I recommend you guys to just go out and mess with some of these settings. Go, figure out what your camera's capable of. Look up on the internet. Just Google whether or not your camera is an ISO variant camera. Because if it's not, and then you're exposing for the highlights and underexposing, you're not going to get the same quality images that I am in these sort of situations. So there may be a different workaround for you guys that have those types of cameras. So again, just go out, mess with the cameras. I think that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate you guys. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please give us a good review. It really helps the podcast out. Other than that, I'll see you guys next week. Keep shooting. Peace.